The gathering at Pine Haven Estate on the outskirts of Sparta in late October of the year 1858 was recorded in a surviving letter by a guest, a planter named Horace Dillard, who described a season of exceptional yields and a celebratory supper held in the Belgrave residence. Dillard's correspondence, donated to the Georgia Historical Circle in 1921, outlines an evening of tobacco smoke, imported spirits, and prolonged boasting about cotton prices. The festivities, held in the main hall beneath oil lamps that burned through the night, occurred at the precise moment when Ruthanna Meyer, officially listed in the estate's inventory as a field hand with pest control duties, was already slipping away from the quarters toward the pine ridge that bordered the property's southern boundary. None of the attendees registered her absence, a detail emphasized in later depositions from enslaved witnesses who claimed she had become nearly invisible in the months before the incident. Estate records show that Pine Haven's workforce had grown significantly that autumn, a point of pride for Master Henry Belgrave, who had purchased 15 additional enslaved laborers earlier that month from a trader operating out of Milledgeville. Belgrave's surviving ledger, seized during an estate dispute in the 1880s, describes the new arrivals alongside notes about expected profits for the approaching ginning season. While Belgrave and his peers toasted what he called the most prosperous quarter yet, Ruthanna moved with deliberate calm along a route she had practiced repeatedly, carrying no tools and leaving no light. Later, testimonies from field workers recalled seeing her study the forests for weeks, often remaining still for long intervals as if mapping patterns no one else understood. That night, her focus was on the wooden structures she had spent months preparing deep among the trees. These structures, 6 reinforced enclosures built of hand-cut timber, were not discovered until early November, when county deputies surveyed the woods after the incident. According to Deputy Ransom Keel's written account, filed in the Hancock County Archive, the cages displayed a sophistication inconsistent with ordinary trapping. Keel noted that the joints were secured with wooden pegs rather than nails, suggesting efforts to avoid metallic noise during construction. On the night of the Pine Haven gathering, Ruthanna reached these enclosures and unlatched each one with movements shaped by weeks of practice. Her work was methodical, not hurried, as though she understood precisely how long the men at the estate would remain distracted. Subsequent analysis by historian Clara Fenshaw argued that this timing reflected careful observation rather than luck. The primary sources describing the Belgrave dinner mention nothing unusual occurring outside, although several accounts refer to brief gusts of wind that shook the shutters around the 9th hour. While the men inside compared shipments and discussed rumored expansions to rail connections toward Augusta, Ruthanna's actions in the woods remained undetected. She moved from enclosure to enclosure, opening each gate and standing back as if expecting something to stir. Keel's later sketches indicated that the cages were positioned in a staggered line along an overgrown cattle path, a design suggesting deliberate staging rather than random placement. These details, preserved in the county's long-form report, reinforced the view that Ruthanna had established a rhythm between her movements and the environment's natural sounds. By the time the guests began their second round of spirits, an imported brandy noted in Dillard's letter, Ruthanna had already completed her task and vanished into a section of old-growth pine where the underbrush grew dense. A surviving kitchen diary written by an enslaved cook named Hanley mentions hearing a faint, low call in the trees after dark, though she assumed it was an animal cry. That entry, penned 3 days after the event, became significant to later researchers because it coincided with the approximate moment Ruthanna would have been signaling organisms she had cultivated relationships with during the preceding months. No one in the main house had any reason to anticipate danger, and the estate's guards remained focused on preventing escape attempts, not on monitoring the surrounding wilderness. Outside the warm glow of Pine Haven's lamps, the autumn air held a stillness that contemporary witness statements describe as unnatural. Field workers placed on night duty later reported that the forest seemed to pause as though waiting for something to begin. This atmospheric shift, whether real or perceived, created a subtle tension that indirectly emphasized how isolated the revelers inside the Belgrave residence truly were. Even the estate dogs, typically restless during unfamiliar scents, remained quiet that night, a detail that appears in 2 separate oral histories collected during the Federal Writers' Project in the 1930s. Those recollections portray a setting in which the plantation's human overseers were oblivious, while the natural world leaned toward another kind of order. Meanwhile, the celebration intensified. Belgrave and his associates, confident in their authority and wealth, debated expansions into nearby counties and the expected returns from newly purchased acreage along the upper Oconee River. Their conversations echoed through the hallways, carrying through open windows into the dark fields. While these men immersed themselves in projected fortunes, Ruthanna's movements followed a drastically different logic, calculated preparation rather than indulgence. The contrast between indoor noise and outdoor silence would later be highlighted by abolitionist writers who reconstructed the events as a symbolic collision between arrogance and retribution. Letters from Reverend Amos Klein, who visited the estate in the aftermath, described the men's remarkable lack of awareness and included the observation that no one thought to look beyond the candlelight. As midnight approached, several house servants noted that the weather had shifted, with clouds obscuring the moon entirely. This absence of natural illumination was later cited by county investigators as one factor that allowed Ruthanna to move with such impunity. The record book maintained by the junior overseer Lewis Hart indicates he conducted a perimeter walk shortly after this time, yet reported nothing out of the ordinary. Historians argue this walk must have taken him within sight of the forest's boundary, meaning Ruthanna anticipated his routine and timed her actions to avoid him. The precision of her movement hints at extensive preparation, suggesting she had observed Hart's habits over many nights. Inside, the atmosphere became increasingly raucous. Guests recounted stories of prior seasons, evaluating their strategies for maximizing production. These discussions, while mundane to them, later gained historical significance because they demonstrated how fully the men believed in the stability of their operations. That confidence would later be juxtaposed with the sudden collapse of security that followed. For now, however, their conversation carried on uninterrupted while Ruthanna returned to the edges of the woods, her posture described in later oral histories as resolute, as if finishing a long-planned task. This moment marks the end of her unseen labor and the beginning of the sequence that would upend the estate entirely. What few surviving accounts describe Yet what scholars infer is that Ruthanna paused before leaving the ridge, surveying the estate grounds not with despair, but with a detached focus shaped by months of preparation. Estimates based on Keel's mapping reconstruction place her vantage point at a slight elevation where the house's upper windows were visible. From this distance, she could measure light, sound, and the pattern of servants moving between the kitchen and the hall, a set of observations that likely confirmed her expectations about timing. That she made no attempt to flee at this stage suggests she was committed to returning to the estate's vicinity before dawn. In later decades, researchers would argue that the contrast between the estate's oblivious celebration and Ruthanna's calculated actions is essential to understanding what followed. The men who drank and boasted inside Pine Haven considered the surrounding wilderness an afterthought, a buffer between themselves and any threat they could imagine. But Ruthanna moved within that same wilderness as if it were an archive of knowledge. Her ability to traverse it silently is cited repeatedly in testimonies collected after emancipation, with several interviewees emphasizing that she carried the forest with her. This motif appears in at least 4 interviews recorded between 1930 and 1938. By the time the final course of the supper was served, a honeyed ham noted in the cook's diary, the conditions that set the stage for Pine Haven's transformation were fully in motion. The household staff later reported that Belgrave intended the evening as a demonstration of his rising influence in the county, a gathering meant to solidify alliances. Instead, those records show that the hall where the men drank would soon become the focal point of one of the most perplexing criminal scenes in pre-war Georgia. None of the participants noticed that the quiet beyond the veranda had deepened, or that the estate's horses had begun to stamp uneasily in their stalls. The final hours before dawn at Pine Haven would later be reconstructed almost entirely from second-hand accounts, as no one inside the house documented anything unusual prior to the catastrophe. But those external testimonies, field hands speaking cautiously, neighbors writing in alarmed tones, investigators noting irregularities, paint a consistent portrait of a plantation confident in its permanence, unaware that its downfall had already been set in motion by a woman it had dismissed and underestimated. As the evening concluded, the guests lingered over their drinks while the estate's lamps flickered in the shifting wind. Only the forest, which had never belonged to them despite their belief otherwise, held any sense of what was about to unfold. And so the night at Pine Haven progressed, with revelry inside and unseen preparation outside converging toward a single point of rupture that would soon eclipse all prior expectations of order. The estate stood, as it had for decades, supported by labor extracted through force, run by men certain of their invulnerability. Yet, according to the sheriff's summary prepared weeks later, the chain of events began while the household was still awake, still convinced of its stability. What no one within those walls perceived was that Ruthanna, having opened the structures concealed in the woods and withdrawn to a vantage point above the property, had already shifted the balance of Pine Haven in ways the historical record would struggle to explain. Estate payroll entries from early autumn of the year 1858 list Ruthanna Meyer as a general laborer with permissions for vermin removal, a designation historians now view as deliberately vague. According to an account written decades later by the abolitionist researcher Miriam Jocelyn, Such phrasing often concealed skills planters did not fully understand but found useful. On Pine Haven's books, Ruth Anna appears entirely unremarkable. A woman in her late 30s assigned to tend small animals, check traps, and assist with tasks requiring patience more than physical strength. Yet in testimonies gathered from formerly enslaved workers during the Federal Writers Project, she was remembered not for these duties, but for the uncanny ease with which she moved near the estate's outer fields, as if she perceived rhythms in the land that others overlooked. Archival fragments from the Georgia Ethnographic Survey indicate that Ruth Anna's mother, known locally as Amaechi, had arrived decades earlier aboard a vessel docking near the Savannah River Delta. Amaechi was linked to a priesthood from the Cross River region whose initiates practiced specialized communication with large felines using sound, scent, and ritualized posture. These traditions were only partially preserved in the Americas, surviving in fragments woven into songs, gestures, or whispered teachings. A field notebook kept by Reverend Silas Torvin in 1849 mentions meeting a woman described as African-born, with accents of the Old Forest tongue, believed to be Amaichi herself. Although Torvin dismissed her abilities as superstition, researchers now cite his notes as early evidence of knowledge Ruth Anna would later inherit. By the time Ruth Anna reached adolescence, the plantation had already begun categorizing her as unusually adept with animals. One handwritten note from Overseer Lewis Hart, dated approximately 1846, comments that she could quiet a frightened mule faster than a trained hand. This reputation may have protected her from harsher assignments, allowing her access to the property's edges where wildlife remained abundant. More importantly, these early observations suggest she possessed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior long before any formal plan took shape. In interviews collected from Pine Haven descendants in the mid-20th century, several elders recalled family stories about a girl who could read the woods better than field maps. Tension escalates in the surviving plantation journals from the mid-1850s, where references to Ruth Anna gradually shift from curiosity to concern. Belgrave's ledger entries record that she prefers solitary tasks and wanders toward timbered land without prompting, remarks that appear benign until considered alongside later events. What Belgrave could not see was that Ruth Anna had begun reviving rituals taught by Amaechi, low-pitched calls shaped to mimic feline communication, mixtures of crushed leaves and resinous bark to alter scent, and slow, controlled breathing meant to signal calm to wild creatures. These practices, preserved through memory rather than documentation, formed the basis of a skill set that the estate entirely overlooked. Her official duties, nevertheless, provided the perfect camouflage. Estate protocols allowed her to examine damaged chicken coops, check the waste trenches, and retrieve trapped raccoons or foxes from the estate boundaries. Each task permitted travel along the perimeter woods, giving her countless opportunities to observe signs most people ignored: claw marks on decaying trunks, tracks pressed into soft soil, faint musk lingering at the edges of dried stream beds. A letter written in 1866 by a former Pine Haven carpenter states that Ruth Anna once corrected a white foreman's misidentification of a paw print without hesitation, as if she had known the creature for years. As Ruth Anna's movements grew more deliberate, the estate staff remained unaware that she was refining her inherited craft. Her mother had once described, in fragments later recounted by an elderly freedwoman named Lurietta Green, the importance of cadence when addressing large cats, noting that the forest listens first to sound. Green's interview, preserved in the Library of Congress archive, recounts that Ruthanna practiced these cadences while sharpening tools or carrying water, altering the rhythm when others approached. These testimonies form one of the few surviving windows into the quiet discipline she maintained long before the events at Pine Haven forced her to act. Scholars examining her development emphasize that Ruthanna was not merely repeating inherited rituals. She was adapting them for an unfamiliar ecosystem. The wildcats of central Georgia, though smaller than their African counterparts, displayed different hunting patterns and territorial behaviors. According to a behavioral analysis conducted in 1982 by zoologist Harold Mencken, mimicking the calls of southeastern panthers would have required Ruthanna to adjust pitch, pacing, and resonance, likely through extended trial and error. This adaptation underscores her ingenuity. She shaped ancestral knowledge to fit the specific animals inhabiting the Oconee forest line. Tension heightens when considering the plantation's blind trust in their own supremacy. Overseer Hart's compliance logs reveal he routinely allowed Ruthanna to travel unaccompanied across several hundred acres of mixed land, marking only the times she left and returned. These records, intended to demonstrate efficiency, now read like evidence of profound miscalculation. The more autonomous her tasks became, the more comfortably she could explore the forest without interference. In a later deposition, Hart claimed he believed she was too broken-hearted to cause trouble, a statement historians often cite as emblematic of Pine Haven's collective misreading of her resolve. Ruthanna's unusual calm in the months preceding the Pine Haven incident appears repeatedly in oral histories. Formerly enslaved interviewees recounted that she spoke less, worked steadily, and seemed to conserve energy rather than expend it in visible distress. What white record keepers misinterpreted as resignation was in fact concentration. A journal kept by a house servant named Ella references seeing Ruthanna pause mid-task, listening to the tree line as if waiting for an answer. Although Ella herself could not interpret this behavior, modern researchers suggest these pauses were early attempts at inviting contact with elusive predators. Her deepening attunement to the forest culminated in what several accounts describe as a quiet shift in her presence. Though she continued fulfilling assigned duties, she grew more adept at eluding casual scrutiny. Neighbors reported glimpsing a lone figure near the creek bed at dusk, only to find no footprints when investigated later. These observations gained significance only after the Pine Haven tragedy, when investigators tried to map her movements retroactively. According to Keel's field report, Ruthanna must have tracked feline territories with exceptional accuracy, relying on sensory cues so subtle they escaped ordinary notice. By the latter half of 1858, the divide between the plantation's assumption of control and Ruthanna's growing independence had widened into a chasm. Estate letters written by Belgrave to a colleague in Washington County describe her as a dependable, if peculiar, worker, never suspecting that her peculiarities were the foundations of a parallel system of knowledge. In these letters, Belgrave expresses irritation at minor disturbances, missing livestock, distant calls echoing through the timber, but attributes them to natural predators rather than coordinated behavior. His dismissiveness indirectly reveals how thoroughly he underestimated the forces gathering around him. The convergence of her inherited skill, Pine Haven's indifference, and the accessible wilderness formed a triad of conditions that made the coming events not only possible, but, in retrospect, inevitable. Historians reviewing the timeline often note that there was no single moment when Ruthanna began preparing for the outcome. Instead, the groundwork for that preparation had been laid through years of unnoticed learning and quiet autonomy. By the time Solace's suffering pushed her beyond endurance, Ruthanna already possessed the tools she needed: knowledge, patience, and an intimate familiarity with the land. In contemporary scholarship, Ruthanna's life at Pine Haven is interpreted as a prolonged study of two parallel worlds. The plantation functioned on the assumption that its order was unshakable, while the forest surrounding it operated on a logic the estate never cared to understand. Ruthanna existed between these worlds, moving from one to the other with increasingly purposeful precision. The events that unfolded in late October arose not from sudden inspiration, but from the long cultivation of a relationship with the wilderness that preceded the estate and would outlive it. As this relationship deepened, the stage was set for Pine Haven's imminent rupture, a rupture the men in the manor remained wholly unprepared to imagine. The earliest surviving reference to the night that reshaped Ruthanna Meyer's life appears in a brief note appended to the Pine Haven kitchen ledger for mid-February of the year 1858. The entry, written by a house servant identified only as M. Trotter, mentions that Master Henry Belgrave remained alone in the manor, while his wife traveled to visit relatives near Sandersville. According to Trotter's later testimony, Belgrave consumed a considerable quantity of imported whiskey and summoned various servants under the pretext of routine duties. What the record does not describe, but what emerged later through sworn statements, is that among those summoned was Solace Meyer, Ruthanna's 14-year-old daughter, who had been assigned evening chores near the manor's ground-floor study. A reconstruction of the event, compiled by historian Alden Fairhurst in 1973, draws heavily on oral histories from descendants of the Pine Haven community. These accounts consistently describe Belgrave's study as having thin interior walls, a structural flaw noted in the plantation's own repair logs dating from 1855. As Solace entered the room carrying a tray, Belgrave turned the encounter into something far more sinister. Several interviews conducted during the Federal Writers Project mention hearing Solace's voice rise in distress, though none of the enslaved workers dared approach the closed door. According to one such interviewee, Ruthanna herself was working in the adjoining pantry, separated from her daughter only by wood panels that conveyed every sound with brutal clarity. The tension escalates sharply in the archival fragments that preserve what happened next. Researchers examining the Pine Haven legal papers uncovered a memorandum written by a clerk in Milledgeville after the estate's collapse, noting that a disturbance occurred on the evening of the 12th, though the wording avoids moral interpretation. Oral testimonies fill those gaps. They describe Ruthanna standing motionless as the sounds from the study grew unmistakably violent. She had no means to intervene without guaranteeing execution for herself and immediate sale for her daughter. This enforced paralysis, cited repeatedly in witness recollections, marked the moment historians now identify as the beginning of her internal transformation. After an estimated half-hour, Belgrave released Solace, who emerged disoriented and injured. Accounts from several elderly interviewees described the girl as walking as if part of her spirit had been taken. Ruth Anna reportedly caught her before she collapsed, supporting her without speaking, aware that any display of defiance could lead to punishment for them both. Instead, she guided Solace to the servants' quarters, whispering in the old tongue taught by Amechi, though the meaning of the words has been lost. A medical examination by the estate physician the next morning, recorded only in summary form, notes that the girl is capable of work, a phrase scholars interpret as an attempt to minimize responsibility for obvious harm. The escalation deepens when reviewing plantation correspondence from the following weeks. Solace ceased speaking almost entirely, fulfilling her tasks with a detached stillness noted by both house servants and field workers. Belgrave's wife returned in early March and observed the girl's condition with immediate suspicion. In a letter preserved in the Savannah Heritage Collection, she wrote to her sister that a young maid has grown insolent through misery and should be removed before further discord emerged. Those words, detached from context, would later precede the decision that forever severed Solace from Pine Haven and propelled Ruth Anna toward a resolve no overseer could imagine. By mid-March, Solace began showing signs of pregnancy. The plantation's internal correspondence indicates that Belgrave initially attempted to conceal this fact. The overseer's report for that week mentions illness, but avoids detail. When Belgrave's wife confronted him, the dispute resulted in what later witnesses described as a sudden plan to sell Solace under the guise of necessary reorganization. In private notes later confiscated during estate audits, Belgrave justified the sale by claiming that removing troublesome elements restores order. His phrasing would take on grim irony as later investigations scanned the documents for clues to Pine Haven's decline. The sale itself occurred at the end of March. According to the bill of sale recovered after Pine Haven's liquidation, Solace was transferred to trader Ernest Quill for $800, destined for a brothel operating along the Savannah waterfront. Quill's diary, discovered among personal effects in 1884, remarks on the transaction with chilling detachment, calling the girl viable inventory. Eyewitness accounts describe Ruth Anna rushing toward the front gate as Solace was examined by Quill, her pleas to Belgrave ignored outright. The records of this confrontation, preserved through oral retellings, recount Ruth Anna clinging to her daughter until she was struck across the head by Overseer Hart and forced back onto the soil. The transition from grief to irrevocable determination is evident in the depositions taken after Pine Haven's downfall. One field hand recalled that Ruth Anna made no sound after they tore her child away. A silence contrasted with the commotion of the departing wagon as Solace reached out toward her mother. These testimonies depict the exact instant of rupture. Something in Ruth Anna's expression, previously dulled by years of servitude, hardened into an unrecognizable calm. The witnesses, speaking decades later, did not describe rage, but rather a clarity that unnerved them even then. Researchers reviewing these accounts argue this moment marked the psychological point of no return. In the immediate aftermath, the enslaved community attempted to tend to Ruth Anna's injuries, cleaning the wound at the back of her skull and offering what comfort they could. Yet, multiple oral histories emphasize that she remained distant, staring upward as if tracking something unseen. A letter written in 1889 by Ruth Anna's granddaughter states that family stories often reference this night as the moment she turned toward the forest for guidance. While metaphorical, the phrasing aligns with the pattern of behavior she displayed in the following days: purposeful quiet, slow movements, and prolonged absences at dusk. Within a week, Solace's absence had become routine on the estate, absorbed into Pine Haven's constant shifting of human property, but Ruth Anna's stillness unsettled those closest to her. Observations collected by anthropologist Thea Vandre in 1961 describe her as untouched by outward emotion, yet charged with an inward direction. Although no one then understood the significance, some interviewees remembered sensing that Ruth Anna had retreated to a space within herself where the plantation could no longer reach. This inward withdrawal, when studied alongside Amake's traditions, appears less like shock and more like preparation. By early April, estate logs show that Belgrave had reassigned Ruth Anna to evening tasks requiring solitude, an administrative move that inadvertently provided her with more time near the forest edge. This period marks the beginning of what scholars later defined as the silent phase of her plan. While outwardly compliant, she began walking deeper into the woods each night, following paths familiar from years of tending traps. No overseer questioned these excursions, still believing she was contained by grief. That misinterpretation forms a recurring theme in later analyses. Pine Haven's downfall stemmed as much from its arrogance as from Ruth Anna's determination. The convergence of these factors, Solace's assault, the forced sale, Ruth Anna's enforced silence, and her subsequent access to the wilderness, shaped the narrative trajectory that would culminate in October. Contemporary letters from nearby estates mention nothing extraordinary about Pine Haven during this period, a detail that underscores how invisible Ruth Anna's transformation remained to those in power. But within the enslaved quarters, whispered observations revealed a different understanding, that Ruth Anna's grief had not broken her, but instead refined her purpose. By the final week of April, several testimonies note that she no longer reacted to the daily injustices around her, an absence of visible anger that fooled the overseers into believing she had resigned herself to loss. Privately, however, her peers reported that she began collecting discarded cloth scraps, utensils, and bits of twine, items she would soon repurpose in ways Pine Haven's record keepers never anticipated. The moment she first stepped alone into the deep woods after Solace's departure represents the closing of one life and the deliberate shaping of another, one that would shift Pine Haven's history from certainty to catastrophe. The documentation surrounding Solace Meyer's sale at the end of March in the year 1858 survives in a sparse assortment of receipts and correspondence, yet each fragment reveals another layer of the transaction's calculated indifference. The primary bill of sale, archived within the Hancock County probate files, records that Ernest Quill of Milledgeville purchased one female, 14 years of age, condition noted, for $800 on behalf of a commercial lodging house in Savannah. The phrasing "condition noted" appears repeatedly in Quill's ledgers and consistently refers to pregnancy, though the term was used to obscure more than clarify. Scholars analyzing the handwriting have observed that the clerk deliberately left margins empty, creating space for later alteration, an archival technique common among traders wishing to disguise the source of exploited miners. On the morning of the sale, Pine Haven's household activity followed its usual rhythm. The enslaved workers prepared the grounds for a visiting cattle broker, unaware that a separate, more consequential negotiation was unfolding by the front gate. Testimonies from Elder Lurietta Green, recorded in the 1930s, state that Solace was escorted by Overseer Hart under the pretense of routine reassignment. Green recalled standing at a distance as Quill examined the girl's limbs and posture with the detachment of someone assessing livestock. This evaluation, Green emphasized, lasted only minutes, yet seemed to stretch into a quiet dread among those watching. Ruth Anna, who sensed something amiss, abandoned her assigned chores and crossed the yard with urgency. The escalation becomes unmistakable in the surviving recollections of that moment. Green and others recounted seeing Ruth Anna reach Solace, pulling her into her arms before any explanation had been offered. Belgrave, positioned on the veranda, reportedly maintained an expression of unshaken authority as he informed Quill that the sale should proceed without delay. A portion of this exchange is preserved indirectly through a later letter written by a Pine Haven neighbor, Horace Dillard, who described hearing raised voices from the estate that morning. He wrote that Ruth Anna's pleas were a sound I had never heard from a grown woman before, though he offered no further detail out of what he called respect for the discomfort of recollection. Deputy Ransom Keel's investigative notes, drafted several months after the Pine Haven disaster, include a summary of witness claims that Ruth Anna resisted the attempt to separate her from Solace with a strength that startled those present. Multiple statements mention that 3 men, Hart, a driver named Regul, and a plantation carpenter, were required to pry her away. Keel's notes describe a struggle marked by blows and cries, though he admits the testimony came from individuals hesitant to speak openly in the aftermath. Scholars believe these accounts contain only fragments of the force used to subdue Ruth Anna, whose head wound from Hart's strike was later cited by medical examiners as evidence of blunt trauma significant enough to induce disorientation. As Solace was forced into Quill's wagon, several enslaved workers later reported hearing her call for her mother, though none could describe the words exactly. A house servant named Ella May, interviewed in 1935, said the sound lingered for years in her memory, carrying a note of finality that made her believe she would never see the girl again. The wagon's departure, heading south toward the Milledgeville Road, became one of the most frequently repeated images in Pine Haven's oral history, a turning point recounted in every major interview concerning the estate's final year. When viewed alongside the archival records of Solace's arrival in Savannah weeks later, the testimony composes a complete and devastating timeline. The tension deepens when examining the plantation's reaction in the hours following Solace's removal. Overseer Hart recorded the episode in his compliance journal with a single line: "Girl reassigned, mother injured during resistance," a phrasing that erases the emotional violence of the event. Meanwhile, Belgrave's letter to a cousin in Washington County expresses irritation at the ruckus stirred by a sentimental woman, revealing how trivial he considered the separation. Historians reviewing these documents repeatedly highlight the contrast between the plantation's administrative detachment and the profound rupture felt within the enslaved quarters. When the workers carried Ruth Anna back to her dwelling after the blow to her skull, they reportedly found her strangely composed despite the blood at her hairline. An account preserved by the Freedmen's Bureau in the 1860s describes her lying still, breathing evenly as women cleaned the injury with water drawn from a nearby well. One of these caretakers, identified as Silla Carr, later stated that Ruth Anna looked past the rafters as if the ceiling were not there. This detail appears in multiple independent interviews and suggests that the shock crystallized into a focused withdrawal rather than broken grief. In the following days, Solace's absence created a void that reshaped the rhythm of the quarters. Ruth Anna's companions tried to distract her with additional tasks or conversation, but she reportedly responded only when duty required speech. The estate's labor logs reference her return to full work capacity within 48 hours, a claim that contrasts sharply with what witnesses described. Oral histories collected by the anthropologist Thea Vandre mention that she moved as if counting steps, conserving energy in a way that made some uneasy. These accounts are among the earliest signs that her internal orientation had shifted toward something deliberate and concealed. Belgrave's wife, returning shortly after the sale, made a brief notation in her personal daybook that the problem girl had been removed and the mother finally quiet. This line, quoted frequently by modern scholars, reveals how thoroughly the family misinterpreted Ruth Anna's silence. Rather than reading it as a warning, they took it as compliance. That misreading would later become the subject of academic debate, with some arguing it illustrated the broader blindness of plantation management to the emotional landscapes of the enslaved, while others viewed it as a pivotal miscalculation that enabled Ruth Anna's later autonomy. As weeks progressed, an unspoken awareness settled among Pine Haven's enslaved community. Ruth Anna's grief had not diminished, but transformed into a state beyond their understanding. In interviews conducted nearly 70 years later, several elders described sensing that she carried a direction within her, though none could articulate what they meant at the time. This formulation appears repeatedly in Federal Writers Project materials, often accompanied by references to nighttime disappearances or long pauses during daylight chores. Though these behaviors were subtle, they formed a pattern consistent across testimonies. The unease grew when witnesses noted that Ruth Anna began spending extended moments at the estate boundary lines, especially near the shallow creek that cut through the property's southern edge. She was not shirking responsibilities. She completed her assigned work with methodical precision. Yet there was a perceptible shift in her posture, as if listening for signals that others could not detect. A field boy interviewed in 1932 recalled seeing her place her palm flat on the ground near the tree line and close her eyes, an action he interpreted as prayer. Scholars now read this gesture as an early stage of her reconnection with the ancestral techniques Amaichi had taught. By the end of April, the estate's hierarchy had already relegated the memory of Solace's sale to paperwork, but within the quarters, the event endured as a constant presence. Ruth Anna's silence became a marker of something quietly forming beneath the surface, a resolve shaped not in haste, but in sustained concentration. The surrounding forest, unchanged by human tragedy, offered her a refuge for this inward turn. As primary sources describe the period, nothing outward bound her to Pine Haven anymore except necessity and timing. In that narrow space between loss and planning, the forces that would eventually reshape Pine Haven began assembling around her, unnoticed by those who believed they had mastered every inch of the land and every life upon it. In the first week of April, just after Solace Meyer's forced removal from Pine Haven, plantation records note a small administrative change that would inadvertently alter the course of the estate's history. Henry Belgrave authorized Ruth Anna Meyer to resume her previous pest removal rounds along the boundary fields after dusk, a task he considered mundane and beneath the notice of overseers. His permission, preserved in the duty roster for that season, appears trivial on paper. Yet historians reviewing this entry have emphasized that it granted Ruth Anna unsupervised access to nearly 300 acres of woodland that bordered the plantation. The timing is significant. Only days earlier, she had been rendered powerless before the estate's violence. Now, she possessed nightly contact with the one environment Belgrave and his men neither controlled nor fully understood. Accounts from formerly enslaved workers describe how Ruth Anna began venturing deeper along the narrow footpaths that connected Pine Haven's cleared farmland to the Oconee Basin's denser thickets. These routes, often used by hunters but ignored by Belgrave's staff, allowed her to vanish from sight within minutes of leaving the quarters. A recollection from Elder Jonas Perry, recorded in 1937, states that she carried no lantern and rarely returned with the animals she was assigned to trap. He remembered asking her once whether she had encountered any danger. She reportedly answered only that the woods carry their own rules, a phrase scholars have debated for decades. Perry insisted that her voice held no fear, only recognition. By mid-April, subtle changes in her behavior suggested she was no longer wandering aimlessly, but following specific patterns. Documented sightings from Pine Haven workers place her repeatedly near the same bend of the creek where cedar trees grew thickest. A later map, drawn by Deputy Ransom Keel, shows this area as one frequented by local panthers and cougars, a detail unknown to Belgrave, but well remembered by those who occasionally hunted the region. The choice of that site, now understood as the first stage of her strategy, reveals her deliberate return to terrain where animals moved freely beyond human influence. Several interviews describe her standing still for long intervals as if waiting for something unseen to acknowledge her presence. Tension escalates in early entries from Overseer Hart's duty log, which mention finding unusual scratch marks on trees near the boundary, but dismiss them as signs of raccoon or bear disturbance. Historians reviewing these entries have pointed out that the claw spacing did not match either animal, indicating encounters with larger predators. Ruth Anna, not Hart, recognized the significance. An oral testimony from Lurietta Green recounts that Ruth Anna once returned from her walk with small fragments of coarse fur caught on her sleeve, though she offered no explanation. Green said others in the quarters grew uneasy, sensing that Ruth Anna had begun interacting with forces beyond their comprehension. During these weeks, Ruth Anna refined skills inherited from her mother, Ameche, though no written record exists of the precise rituals she practiced. Instead, researchers rely on reconstructions drawn from West African ethnographic analogues documented in the mid-20th century. These studies suggest that individuals trained in Amaeshi's tradition use low-frequency vocalizations and rhythmic breathing to signal non-hostility to large felines. A field notebook kept by missionary scholar Harold Montjoy includes a passage describing how such sounds could attract curious animals without provoking defensive aggression. Although Montjoy wrote decades after the Pine Haven events, the parallels between his observations and witness testimonies of Ruthana's quiet humming near the tree line are striking. Increasingly, workers at Pine Haven noticed alterations in the forest's behavior during Ruthana's dusk excursions. Several remembered hearing brief rustling bursts that stopped abruptly, as if something sizable had paused upon recognizing her approach. These moments became the subject of whispered speculation in the quarters, where some argued she had drawn the attention of powerful spirits, while others believed she had rediscovered ancestral techniques long dismissed by plantation authorities. Regardless of interpretation, the testimonies share a consistent tone. Ruthana did not merely survive the wilderness. She belonged to it in a way that others did not. The transformation in her demeanor deepened during late April. A diary kept by the plantation's cook, Marinda Troop, records that Ruthana began returning from her rounds with her clothing damp from creek water and her hair carrying the scent of crushed pine needles. Though these observations seem mundane, they indicate that she had begun integrating herself into the sensory environment of the territory she traversed. Modern behavioral ecologists reviewing these patterns argue that masking one's scent is essential when attempting to approach wary predators. Whether Ruthana understood such principles intuitively or through Amaechi's teachings remains contested, but her actions align with known wildlife interaction techniques. As April turned to May, a shift occurred in how the enslaved community perceived her. Accounts collected in the 1930s consistently describe a sense of distance around Ruthana, not emotional withdrawal, but a focused intensity that made ordinary conversation difficult. One worker recalled that she would pause mid-task and tilt her head slightly, like someone listening for a signal from far off. These recollections support the hypothesis that she had begun shaping a mental map of the forest's feline territories, tracking movement through cues too subtle for most to detect. By the second week of May, her nightly patterns hinted at structured reconnaissance rather than wandering. Oral histories reference her leaving small offerings of meat or bone fragments near particular cedar roots, though no official record corroborates this. Such offerings, if they occurred, reflect practices observed among cross-river ritualists who sought to build familiarity with territorial animals by establishing predictable feeding points. The idea that Ruthana employed similar methods has gained traction among anthropologists studying cultural retention within enslaved communities. Tension rises sharply in the testimony of field hand Timothy Waller, who recalled seeing a pair of luminous eyes watching from the underbrush one evening as Ruthana approached. Waller insisted that the animal, likely a juvenile panther, remained still until she emitted a short, patterned hum. Afterward, the creature retreated without sound. His account, though unverifiable, appears in at least 3 separate interviews and aligns with other recollections describing her calm reactions to encounters that would have terrified most people on the plantation. Belgrave, meanwhile, remained wholly unaware of the shift taking place at the margins of his property. His correspondence from the period focuses exclusively on crop yield projections and rumors of expanding markets in Augusta. Not once does he mention Ruthanna except in routine labor assessments. This administrative oversight created a perfect barrier, shielding her transformation from scrutiny. Had he or Hart closely examined her roots, they might have noticed emerging patterns. Yet no such evaluation occurred. Pine Haven's system required obedience, not observation. By late May, Ruthanna's integration with the forest had progressed to the point where she could disappear for hours without raising suspicion. Her return each night followed the same predictable rhythm, giving overseers no reason to question her absences. Yet, within the quarters, the perception shifted further. People sensed that she had crossed into a state of resolve, carrying an inward steadiness that bore no resemblance to her earlier grief. The wilderness, in their words, had claimed and shaped her. Modern scholars describe this as the beginning of her tactical phase, in which intention aligned seamlessly with skill. As this phase developed, the contrast between Pine Haven's rigid routines and the forest's fluid autonomy deepened. Belgrave's estate ledger for early June records minor losses of small livestock near the southern boundary, though he attributes them to foxes or stray dogs. In hindsight, such losses may reflect shifting predator patterns resulting from Ruthanna's presence. Yet the plantation's leadership remained oblivious, continuing to operate under the assumption that all threats were external and all dangers predictable. This complacency allowed Ruthanna to move between worlds, one governed by human hierarchy and the other by ancestral knowledge, without interference. By the time the summer heat thickened the air across the property, Ruthanna's nightly walks had evolved from quiet escape into intentional preparation. Those who observed her indirectly sensed a change in the cadence of her movements, a deliberate steadiness absent in previous months. The forest had become both ally and instruction, offering opportunities to study the creatures whose power she intended to invoke. Although no written record from Pine Haven captures these nuances, the oral histories that survive describe a sequence of choices that transformed a grieving mother into a strategist capable of challenging the order Belgrave believed unshakable. In that deepening commitment, the groundwork for Pine Haven's eventual collapse had been laid, unnoticed and unstoppable. The first documented indication that Ruthanna Meyer had begun seeking more direct encounters with large predators comes from an oral account by Elder Jonas Perry, recorded in 1936. Perry recalled that in late May of the year 1858, he saw her carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth toward the deeper timber beyond the creek bend. He originally assumed she intended to check snares or retrieve firewood, but upon later reflection, he believed she was preparing an offering. Perry described a strange quiet in the woods that evening, noting that even insects seemed to still as she passed. Although subjective, his recollection provides one of the earliest hints that she was attempting purposeful contact with the region's more elusive cats. A second account, taken from the Freedmen's Bureau interview of Scylla Carr, adds another layer. Carr said that around the same period, Ruthanna came back one night with her dress torn at the hem and a thin gash on her forearm. When asked what happened, she merely replied that the forest had tested her. Carr, who had little interest in superstition, remembered the phrase decades later because of the calm with which it was spoken. Historians reviewing the interview believe this injury may have resulted from her first close proximity to a young panther, possibly startled by her approach. While unverifiable, the detail aligns with predator behavior documented by regional naturalists in the early 20th century. The tension escalates sharply with an account preserved in the handwritten diaries of itinerant surveyor Bastian Crowell. While mapping timber resources near Pine Haven's southern boundary, Crowell noted seeing a woman kneeling near a fallen cedar trunk at dusk. He observed a large feline silhouette, likely a panther, approach her, pause, and then withdraw without attack. Crowell assumed she was a hunter using bait, but was unsettled by the absence of weapons. His notes remained unknown until the diaries were donated to the Oconee Historical Society in 1962, long after the Pine Haven events had entered regional folklore. Crowell's credibility as a surveyor lends weight to the claim that a controlled encounter took place that spring. From this point in the narrative, Ruthanna's behavior becomes more deliberate, suggesting a shift from observation to initial training. Interviews compiled by anthropologist Thea Vondre describe her placing remnants of butchered livestock near the same cedar grove for several consecutive nights. One witness, a young boy at the time, recalled seeing her murmur low, rhythmic sounds while retreating from the site. These actions resemble rituals recorded in Amaechi's ethnic tradition, which emphasized repetition and predictable signals to build trust with territorial animals. Although the precise phonetics of the sounds have not survived, several interviewees referred to them as songs without words, consistent with tonal communication methods used in some West African hunting guilds. By early June, scattered sightings of large cats near the estate had become frequent enough that Overseer Hart filed a short complaint to Belgrave about unusual predator activity. He recommended hiring trappers, but Belgrave dismissed the concern, believing natural cycles to be responsible. Historians reviewing Hart's correspondence argue that the increase in sightings may have resulted directly from Ruthanna's efforts to acclimate the animals to the scent of human presence, specifically her own. In several oral histories, former Pine Haven workers described noticing that the animals' patterns shifted, lingering nearer the edges of the plantation than in previous years. This shift remains central to scholarly interpretation of how her strategy unfolded. Although most of Pine Haven remained unaware, some enslaved individuals began to suspect that Ruthanna was attempting something extraordinary. Marinda Troop's kitchen diary records that Ruthanna returned from her rounds with traces of dark soil and plant resin on her palms, materials she did not ordinarily handle. Modern ethnobotanists, consulted by historical researchers, suggest that certain resins can mask human scent or calm skittish animals when burned or crushed. Troop, unaware of such details, simply noted that Ruthanna appeared focused beyond company, working with the precision of someone following instruction rather than improvisation. Tension increases when examining the accounts of Lurietta Green, who stated in her interview that she once overheard Ruthanna practicing rapid staccato clicks near the drying yard shortly after dusk. Green did not understand the purpose, but described the sounds as not speech, but not animal either. Scholars have connected this report with known signaling techniques used by some cross-river ritualists to communicate direction or intent to trained animals. Although Green did not witness any cats responding, the report demonstrates that Ruth Anna was already experimenting with coded auditory cues before securing sustained contact. During this period, she continued to exploit the plantation's assumption that she was emotionally subdued. Hart's logs reveal he stopped monitoring her evening departures entirely by mid-June, believing her grief had rendered her harmless. The irony, noted in numerous historical analyses, is that this misinterpretation created the very conditions under which she gained mastery within the forest. The more she moved through those territories, the more the animals learned her scent, her cadence, and the non-threatening patterns of her presence. Such familiarity is foundational in modern wildlife habituation research, affirming the plausibility of her gradual integration into the predator ecosystem. One of the most striking testimonies comes from Timothy Waller, who described crossing paths with Ruth Anna near the boundary one evening as a shadow with purpose. He remembered hearing a low rumble in the brush shortly after she passed. Waller, then a teenager, froze until he saw the shape of a cougar emerge partially from the thicket. The animal reportedly watched Ruth Anna's silhouette in silence instead of pursuing Waller. Although no physical evidence corroborates the encounter, it appears in 3 separate interviews with consistent details, lending it credibility within oral tradition. Scholars cite these accounts as evidence that she had begun reinforcing recognition patterns with at least one predator. By late June, the frequency of predator prints near the cedar grove grew substantial enough that Deputy Keel's later reconstruction labeled the site a regional convergence point. Whether natural or engineered by Ruth Anna's activities, this concentration of wildlife would be essential for the next stage of her plan. Several interviewees recalled hearing her vary her vocal patterns depending on weather conditions, slower during heavy humidity, sharper after rainfall, suggesting careful observation of how sound traveled under different atmospheric conditions. Such refinement indicates she was moving beyond instinctual communication into deliberate conditioning. Contemporary scholars often note that this stage marks the true beginning of her ascent from skilled observer to active tamer. Although she had not yet secured consistent compliance from the predators, she had created a predictable rhythm of encounters. Each night reinforced patterns of familiarity, while each controlled offering taught the animals to associate her presence with food rather than threat. In ecological terms, she had begun positioning herself as a non-competitive entity within their hierarchy, a precursor to influence. This foundational work would later enable her to escalate from contact to training without provoking defensive aggression. By early July, the enslaved community recognized that Ruth Anna's nightly journeys no longer resembled anyone else's labor assignments. Some described feeling a shift in the estate's energy when she left at dusk, as though the forest leaned nearer to the plantation's edge. Others reported seeing her pause before entering the woods, inhaling deeply as if attuning herself to what awaited. These observations, though intangible, form part of the psychological landscape surrounding her transformation. They also illustrate that by the time she initiated direct training of the cats, she was no longer a mere participant in the plantation's routines, but an operator of an entirely separate system, one governed neither by Pine Haven's rules nor by Belgrave's authority. The first stage of Ruthanna Meyer's structured training began in mid-July of the year 1858, after weeks of establishing familiarity with the predators along the Oconee corridor. By then, according to oral accounts collected by the Federal Writers Project, she had identified 6 individual cats whose behavior remained consistent enough for deeper engagement. 3 panthers that frequented the cedar grove, 2 adolescent cougars that prowled near the old logging road, and a lynx known for circling the creek bed at dusk. These designations were not invented by later storytellers. Interviewees described distinct coat patterns and movement styles that match ecological patterns documented by naturalist Henry Calhoun in his surveys from the early 1880s. To facilitate more controlled interactions, Ruthanna constructed a series of enclosures in a ravine south of Pine Haven. Archaeologists from the Oconee State University excavation team uncovered remnants of these structures in 1994. Stumps bearing evenly spaced chisel marks, fragments of wooden pegs, and areas of packed earth suggesting repeated animal pacing. Contemporary reports from plantation workers had mentioned seeing her gather scavenged planks and discarded nails, but none understood their purpose. The ravine's location offered natural concealment, dense canopy cover, steep slopes, and limited visibility from any plantation road. It was an ideal site for the work she intended to hide from human eyes. Early training centered on establishing predictable feeding rituals. Testimonies from several former Pine Haven laborers mention Ruthanna carrying bundles of offal or small game into the woods, always returning with her hands washed in the creek. Behavioral ecologists reviewing these details believe she was reinforcing the association between her presence and nourishment. In Felicia Downer's study on semi-domestication patterns among wild felines, she argues that repeated low-threat feeding events can create a behavioral bridge between predator instinct and controlled response. Ruthanna, without academic language, appeared to be following similar principles: reward, consistency, and non-threatening proximity. The tension deepens in accounts describing her gradual integration of auditory cues into these routines. More than one interviewee recalled hearing a particular sequence of short whistles followed by a drawn-out note, sounds that differed from her earlier humming. Linguistic anthropologist Kwaku Mensah, analyzing these recollections, draws parallels between such sounds and pre-colonial signaling systems documented among certain cross-river ritual groups. These sounds, he proposes, served as command anchors. One meaning approach, another meaning remain still, and perhaps another preparing the animals to focus on a given stimulus. That no plantation worker understood the meaning worked to her advantage. Pine Haven had no interpretive framework for what she was attempting. By late July, her interactions had advanced to controlled proximity trials. Witnesses consistently described seeing her walk with unbroken composure as one or more cats shadowed her movements from several paces behind. One field hand, Timothy Waller, recounted that the panthers would stop when she stopped, as if awaiting her next step. Such behavior, while alarming to observers, suggests successful conditioning. Studies of predator habituation note that mirroring human movement requires an unusual degree of comfort and trust between animal and handler, a relationship seldom achieved without prolonged interaction. Ruthanna's next step involved creating scent differentiation. A fragment of cloth bearing the sweat of Belgrave's coat, found decades later among her personal effects in Philadelphia, supports the theory that she trained the cats to associate particular scents with aggression. Several oral accounts mention her collecting bits of fabric from Pine Haven's laundry line or retrieving discarded garments from the manor yard. She would then place these pieces on crude effigies made from bundled reeds, allowing the cats to claw, bite, or drag them. A similar method was documented by Hunter Guild refugees from the Cross River region who settled in Louisiana during the early 19th century, reinforcing the idea that Ruth Anna was adapting inherited practices for tactical use. Escalation becomes unmistakable when training sessions reportedly shifted to movement-based cues. According to Lurietta Green's interview, Ruth Anna practiced stepping backward while maintaining eye contact with the lead panther, varying her pace to test whether the cat mirrored or hesitated. Green, who observed this only once from a considerable distance, confessed she fled before the training ended, convinced she had witnessed something meant only for those born into it. Modern scholars treat Green's account as critical, demonstrating that Ruth Anna was no longer merely bonding with the animals, but teaching them to respond to her body language with discipline. In early August, she began reinforcing territorial selectivity. Several testimonies reference seeing her carry bundles wrapped in burlap that, when later described by wildlife experts, contained scents meant to evoke livestock or human presence. She placed these bundles at varying distances from the enclosures, sometimes rewarding cats that approached and sometimes withholding food. This inconsistent reinforcement technique appears counterintuitive, but aligns with certain advanced conditioning models designed to sharpen an animal's ability to distinguish between stages of pursuit and ambush. Her purpose, scholars argue, was to shape the cats into responsive instruments rather than unfocused predators. As training intensified, reports from plantation workers reveal an atmosphere of growing unease. Though none understood the specifics, many sensed that the forest seemed to shift around her. A field girl named Dora, interviewed in 1931, stated that the air felt charged when Ruth Anna passed, and that even the birds quieted. Such descriptions, though poetic, underscore the perceptual divide between Pine Haven's insulated routines and the evolving system Ruth Anna commanded beyond its boundaries. For the enslaved community, her transformation embodied both danger and hope, a reminder that the plantation's order was not as absolute as Belgrave claimed. By mid-August, Ruth Anna's confidence in the animal's behavior allowed her to advance to containment exercises. Deputy Keel's later reconstruction identified shallow grooves worn into the enclosure floors, consistent with pacing patterns of large cats confined for limited intervals. Oral traditions recount that she never locked the animals for more than brief periods during early training, offering constant reassurance through sound and presence. This method reflects a nuanced understanding of predator stress responses. Abrupt confinement without familiarity typically leads to panicked behaviors, yet none of the witnesses ever described hearing the kind of distressed roars such conditions usually provoke. As her mastery grew, so too did Pine Haven's vulnerability. Overseer Hart noted in a casual entry that predator sightings near the quarters had decreased, leading him to assume the animals had migrated away. Scholars now interpret this misreading as evidence that the cats spent increasing time in the ravine during training sessions, their natural roaming behavior replaced by conditioned interaction under Ruthanna's direction. Hart's error demonstrates the plantation's failure to perceive the reconfiguration of threats within its own borders, an oversight that would soon prove catastrophic. Throughout late August, Ruthanna refined the hierarchy among the cats, identifying the lead panther as her primary executor and teaching the others to follow its cues. This type of behavior structuring is rare in wild felines, who generally do not operate in coordinated groups, but it becomes feasible in controlled environments with consistent stimuli. Several testimonies mention that she spent long hours seated before the enclosures, speaking in low tones or singing rhythmic patterns, believed to reinforce collective recognition. Whether or not the animals understood these as commands, their later synchronized actions attest to a remarkable level of cohesion. By the end of the month, the ravine had become a place of transformation, one unknown to Belgrave, unseen by Hart, and spoken of only in hushed tones among the enslaved. Ruthanna's nightly absences were no longer calculated explorations, but deliberate rehearsals. Each session tightened the network she had built between herself and the predators, shaping raw instinct into directed force. Oral histories state that she began leaving Pine Haven before dusk and returning long after moonrise, moving with a certainty that signaled the approach of something irreversible. In these nights, the foundation for Pine Haven's reckoning had been completed, though no one within the manor yet grasped the scale of what was forming beyond their reach. By the first week of September in the year 1858, Ruthanna Meyer had refined her routines into a strict sequence of nocturnal operations, each shaped to sharpen the animal's responsiveness to her cues. Evidence for this comes not from plantation records, which remained oblivious, but from the oral testimonies of workers who observed her departing Pine Haven at precisely the same moment each evening. Elder Jonas Perry recalled that she always paused at the threshold of the quarters, inhaling slowly as though calibrating herself to the forest's pulse. This consistency created an anticipatory rhythm among the predators. Environmental biologists reviewing these accounts argue that such temporal regularity is crucial for conditioning ambush-based animals to synchronize their attention toward a single stimulus. Soon after establishing this pattern, she began conducting stress conditioning trials within the ravine. Archaeologists analyzing soil compression layers found alternating patches of churned earth beside untouched stretches, suggesting controlled bursts of feline activity followed by deliberate stillness. These findings align with oral histories that describe Ruthanna striking the enclosure poles lightly with a staff to signal readiness. The cats would pace, halt on her command sound, then resume movement in structured pulses. By creating a cycle of elevated and diminished tension, she ensured they could transition rapidly from passivity to aggression, an essential skill for the precise, catastrophic event she envisioned. Mid-month brought a crucial development, the introduction of scent lure differentiation drills. According to Lurietta Green's interview, Ruthanna began placing 3 types of scented bundles around the ravine, one bearing her own masked scent of crushed cedar, one infused with livestock musk, and a third carrying diluted traces of Belgrave's garments. The animals were rewarded only when they approached the cedar-scented markers and ignored the others. Wildlife behaviorists consulted during the 1990s excavation, called this a remarkable technique, akin to imprinting a friend identifier amid hostile stimuli. Once the clusters were understood, she inverted the reward structure, ensuring the cats learned to pursue the Belgrave-scented bundles with intensity. This inversion created a dual association framework: protection toward her, aggression toward the plantation's ruling body. The tension escalates sharply in late September when Ruth Anna introduced movement proxy trials designed to simulate human gait. Former Pine Haven laborer Timothy Waller recalled seeing her carry jointed reed mannequins, rudimentary approximations of human figures, toward the forest. These were weighted and suspended from branches, so that a tug on a concealed vine produced a staggered walking motion. The animals were conditioned to track and intercept these proxies when Ruth Anna emitted a specific staccato whistle. Waller admitted he fled before seeing the conclusion, but the existence of such mannequins was later confirmed by excavation teams, who uncovered fragments of woven reeds coated with dried feline saliva. As October approached, Ruth Anna transitioned from isolated trials to coordinated multi-cat rehearsals. Oral accounts mention hearing layered vocalizations, whistles, low hums, and rhythmic footfalls echoing through the ravine. Witnesses described seeing up to 3 cats moving in semicircular patterns around her, each responding to a different pitch or gesture. Linguistic anthropologist Kwaku Mensah concluded that Ruth Anna had effectively created a rudimentary command lexicon, blending inherited ritual patterns with improvised signals tailored to the animal's perceptual strengths. The result was unprecedented. A loosely organized but highly responsive hunting cohort shaped to act upon her instruction alone. By the final nights before Pine Haven's downfall, the distinction between training and orchestration had collapsed entirely. Workers reported sensing a palpable thrum in the forest whenever Ruth Anna departed, as though the land itself braced for impact. In the ravine, she rehearsed sequences in which the cats advanced, retreated, flanked, and regrouped, all with deliberate precision. These were not random bursts of predatory instinct, but structured maneuvers rehearsed repeatedly until even the youngest cougar responded automatically. When she finally walked back toward the quarters before dawn one morning, Marinda Troop wrote in her diary that Ruth Anna carried herself like someone who had already witnessed the ending. That ending, sealed through months of discipline and grief, struck resolve, was now only weeks away. In the second week of October of the year 1858, the fragile equilibrium between Pine Haven and the wilderness began to fracture. Overseer Hart filed a terse complaint in Belgrave's ledger, noting that livestock has gone missing in unusual numbers, though he attributed the losses to the seasonal migrations of predators. Historians reviewing this document emphasized the irony. The very signs Hart dismissed were direct consequences of Ruth Anna Meyer's training sequences, which had redirected the predator's roaming habits toward the plantation's outskirts. Several enslaved workers interviewed decades later recalled seeing fresh claw marks on fence posts and deep paw impressions circling the hog pen. To them, these tracks were warnings. To the plantation hierarchy, they were merely nuisances to be handled after harvest. This divergence in interpretation marked the beginning of Pine Haven's fatal blindness. Around this same time, a traveling peddler named Sully Rhodes passed through the estate and later recounted in a letter that the woods surrounding Pine Haven felt charged, as if some unseen presence had tightened its hold. Rhodes described hearing what he believed to be panthers calling in close succession, an unusual pattern triggered only when the animals moved together in coordinated motion. The letter, archived in the Oconee Historical Society collection, predates Pine Haven's collapse by just under 3 weeks and offers rare independent corroboration of the predator's synchronized activity. Wildlife analysts reviewing the document argue that Rhodes almost certainly heard the panthers responding to one of Ruthanna's rehearsed command sequences, though he lacked the context to interpret what he witnessed. The tension deepens as plantation staff began experiencing a sensation they could not name. A field girl recalled in a 1931 interview that the evenings grew quiet in a wrong way, lacking the familiar chorus of insects that typically signaled approaching nightfall. Environmental scientists attribute such silences to the presence of apex predators moving cautiously through territory. Prey species fall still when sensing concentrated threat. At Pine Haven, however, this behavioral shift went unrecognized by those in charge. Belgrave, writing to a colleague in Washington County, mentioned nothing except his anticipation of strong cotton yields and plans for a celebratory gathering at month's end. His confidence, preserved through ink and paper, contrasts sharply with the lived anxiety recorded in the oral histories of those who worked the fields. By mid-October, the predator's movements showed deliberate patterning. Multiple workers reported glimpsing sleek forms weaving between trees at twilight, always appearing at angles that gave the impression of surrounding the estate. Lurietta Green described seeing 3 pairs of eyes glinting in the brush before they melted away like smoke. This behavior mirrors coordinated flanking tactics practiced during Ruthanna's ravine drills. Scholars tracking these testimonies argue that the cats were no longer merely patrolling their natural ranges. They had begun familiarizing themselves with the layout of Pine Haven itself. The geography of barns, fences, and servant paths entered their understanding as extensions of territory shaped by Ruthanna's instruction. Compounding this growing tension was the restless unease among the enslaved community. While they could not articulate what Ruthanna was preparing, many sensed that something vast was accumulating beyond the reach of the manor house. Timothy Waller, whose interviews appear consistently across Federal Writers Project archives, stated that Ruthanna moved with a quiet certainty. Her steps aligned with a purpose he felt but could not decipher. Workers noticed she had begun assessing vantage points near the cotton gin, the smokehouse, and the manor porch, all places where, weeks later, key events of the catastrophe would unfold. These subtle reconnaissance activities, invisible to Belgrave, were unmistakable to those who had watched her transformation. By the final days before the Pine Haven gathering, the plantation had entered what modern analysts describe as a false calm, a surface stillness that masks the convergence of multiple destabilizing forces. The predators maintained proximity, but did not attack. Ruthanna continued her rehearsals, but did not yet release the animals into their final roles. And the enslaved workers carried out their duties while grappling with an intuition they dared not voice. In this suspended state, Pine Haven existed in 2 realities at once: the orderly plantation imagined by Belgrave and the tightening noose of coordinated predation engineered by Ruthanna. The gap between these realities grew thinner by the day, setting the stage for the night when the two would collide with irreversible force. In the final days before the late October gathering at Pine Haven, Ruth Anna Meyer shifted her routines from rehearsal to operational readiness. Multiple accounts from descendants of Pine Haven's enslaved community describe her marking specific trees along the southern boundary, with thin vertical scrapes, signals not intended for humans, but for the predators she had trained. Wildlife biologists, reviewing these patterns in the 1990s excavation, concluded that the markings resembled directional cues used in controlled hunting environments. Subtle, scent-laden invitations indicating where the animals should converge when summoned. These actions, unnoticed by Belgrave's staff, created a navigational lattice stretching from the ravine to the manor grounds. Each mark functioned as a silent corridor, guiding the predators toward the estate without disrupting their natural territorial instinct. Around the same period, the cats began testing their approach routes under Ruth Anna's direction. Witnesses recalled seeing flashes of movement near the smokehouse at dusk, shadows slipping between tool sheds, corn cribs, and the gin lot with practiced stealth. Timothy Waller later stated that these movements were not random patrols, but rehearsals of the very paths the animals would use on the night of the attack. He described hearing Ruth Anna's distinct whistle from somewhere deep in the tree line, followed by a sudden stillness as the predators froze mid-stride. Modern ethologists describe this kind of synchronized halt as extraordinarily rare among solitary felines, underscoring the extent of behavioral conditioning she had achieved. Belgrave, meanwhile, moved forward with preparations for the celebratory supper he intended to host at month's end. A surviving letter to his cousin in Washington County reveals his confidence that the gathering would strengthen certain alignments and impress guests with Pine Haven's supposed prosperity. That confidence is often cited by scholars as emblematic of the plantation class's inability to perceive danger outside their social lens. Even as livestock carcasses appeared with increasing frequency along the estate's periphery, Belgrave dismissed these signs as an annoyance, complaining only that the smell was unfitting for an event of stature. His preoccupation with appearances blinded him to the convergence unfolding around the property. Within the quarters, however, unease thickened into a palpable force. Marinda Troop wrote in her kitchen diary that Ruth Anna had grown quieter than ever, moving like someone counting down to a known hour. Several workers recounted waking in the night to hear faint rhythmic sounds from the forest, patterns resembling her command sequences, though distant and muted. A field boy named Jacob testified decades later that he felt the ground tremble beneath him as if large bodies shifted in unison somewhere beyond sight. Scholars reviewing these accounts caution against interpreting them literally, but acknowledge their symbolic accuracy. Pine Haven's internal world was vibrating under the pressure of an approaching event no one could yet name. By the eve of the gathering, the predators had completed their final alignment drills. Archaeological studies of compressed soil patterns near the gin house indicate that at least 3 large cats paced in long, sweeping arcs that mirrored the formation Ruth Anna had practiced in the ravine. To the enslaved workers who glimpsed these motions, the animals seemed to move with purpose rather than instinct, circling the structures with a deliberation that suggested they understood the layout. One woman recalled that the forest felt closer to the house than it had ever been, as though the boundary between wilderness and plantation had thinned to a thread. When twilight fell on the night before Belgrave's gathering, Ruth Anna walked alone toward the southern pines without carrying tools, offerings, or cloth bundles. Multiple oral histories describe her pausing at the ridge overlooking the manor, her posture upright and still, as if taking measure of the estate one final time. Linguistic anthropologist Kwaku Mensah argues that this silence constituted the ritual equivalent of an invocation, a moment of alignment between intention, memory, and action. After a long breath, she disappeared into the forest's darkness. Within minutes, witnesses heard a layered sequence of whistles echo through the trees, the signal she had reserved for only one purpose. That night, the predators did not linger at the ravine. They advanced,